Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified, where we like to break down some of those complex Indian legal concepts.
Absolutely.
We really try to simplify them for everyone. And today we're diving deep into control of delegated legislation in India, parliamentary, procedural, and judicial control, doctrine of Ultra Vires, and its effect.
Yeah,
That's a mouthful.
it is.
But this is a crucial topic for anyone who's navigating the complexities of Indian law, because we're going to be looking at how parliament procedures and the judiciary keep a check on the executive branch's lawmaking powers.
You're absolutely right. This topic really gets to the heart of how we balance power in a democracy.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
when we think about it, Parliament sets the main rules, but sometimes they need to give the executive branch a little bit of leeway to sort of fill in the details.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit, because I think on the surface that seems a little counterintuitive.
Right.
Why would Parliament even want to give away some of its power in terms of lawmaking?
It's a great question. Imagine if Parliament had to write these incredibly detailed laws for everything, right? From something as technical as atomic energy regulations to how we manage essential commodities.
Right.
It would be impossible for them to be experts on all of these very technical subjects.
And the process would just take forever.
Exactly. The process would be so slow and they wouldn't be able to respond quickly enough to new situations.
They'd be bogged down in the weeds.
Yeah, and delegated legislation allows Parliament to set that broad framework and then empower the experts within the executive branch to create those more specific rules to ensure that things run smoothly and that we can adapt to changing circumstances.
So if we use the Essential Commodities Act of 1955 as an example, Parliament essentially said, okay, here's the power to declare any commodity as essential, which has huge implications for market control.
Yeah,
You guys go figure out the specifics.
exactly.
Can you imagine if every time a new commodity needed to be designated as essential,
Oh,
Parliament had to have this big debate and amend the act? It would just be a logistical nightmare.
it would be chaos.
Yeah. But obviously, handing over that kind of power, even to experts, has to come with some pretty serious checks and balances.
Oh, for sure.
How does Parliament ensure that this delegated authority isn't misused?
Well, there are several ways that Parliament keeps a watchful eye on things.
Okay.
First off, they can directly control delegated legislation through debates, even when the initial act is being drafted. MPs can voice their concerns, set limits on how much power is being handed over. It's like building in safeguards right from the very beginning.
Okay, so it's not just a rubber stamp. They're actively involved in shaping the boundaries of this delegated power.
Exactly.
But what happens once the act is in place, the executive branch starts making these rules? Does Parliament just step back and say, okay, go do your thing?
Not at all. MPs can actually ask questions and raise issues about any aspect of delegated legislation at any time.
Oh, wow.
And if they're not happy with the government's explanation, they can even push for urgent discussions or resolutions. So it's like Parliament is constantly holding the executive branch accountable for how they're using this delegated power.
So there's constant scrutiny.
Right.
It's not just a one-time check.
Right. And it goes even beyond, individual MPs raising questions. There's a global practice that you see in Commonwealth countries called laying on the table.
Okay.
Essentially, all delegated legislation has to be presented before the legislature.
Okay.
This gives them a chance to actually review it and potentially even challenge it.
So Parliament's kept in the loop about what rules are being created.
Exactly.
It's like requiring a progress report from the executive branch.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. Parliament also has special committees that are specifically focused on what we call subordinate legislation.
Right.
Think of these committees as Parliament's quality control team. They dive deep into 5 key areas to ensure that these rules are not going rogue.
Okay, I'm intrigued now. Let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
What are those 5 areas that they look at so carefully?
Well, first and foremost, they make sure that the delegated legislation is actually sticking to the goals that were outlined in the original act.
Right.
No mission creep allowed.
Right, so they're keeping the executive branch from straying too far from Parliament's original intent.
Exactly. What else are they looking at? They're also on the lookout for anything that might overstep boundaries and block the courts from doing their job.
Right. We can't have the executive branch making rules that undermine the entire judicial system.
Precisely. The third area they look at is whether the legislation has what we call a retrospective effect.
Okay.
In other words, does it apply to the past?
Ah.
Which can be quite controversial.
Retroactive laws. Those can create all sorts of headaches.
Yeah, changing the rules of the game after it's already been played.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what's the fourth area?
The fourth area is all about protecting the principles of natural justice.
Okay.
The right to be heard, fairness, that sort of thing. These committees are there to make sure that delegated legislation doesn't trample on those very important fundamental rights.
Right. That ensures that even though Parliament's not directly making the rules, the process is still fair and just.
Exactly. And finally, the fifth piece of the puzzle is funding.
Okay.
They need to make sure that the legislation isn't dipping into the Consolidated Fund of India without proper justification and transparency.
That's a lot of responsibility on those committees.
It is.
They're really the guardians of good governance when it comes to delegated legislation.
Absolutely.
But I have to wonder, even with all of this oversight from Parliament, are there other ways to ensure that these rules stay within the lines?
Absolutely. That's where procedural control comes in. It's like
Okay.
setting clear rules of the game for how delegated legislation is made and implemented.
Okay, procedural control. Tell me more about why this layer is so important.
Well, transparency is key.
Okay.
First off, any delegated legislation must be published in the official gazette,
Okay.
so everyone knows what the rules are,
Right.
and it prevents anyone from claiming ignorance of the law.
That's crucial for public awareness. But just publishing them isn't enough, right? Are there ways to make sure people can actually have a say in how these rules are created?
Yeah, that's a great point, and this is where the concept of consultation comes in.
Okay.
Now, it's not a universal requirement, but some acts actually mandate that the executive branch consults with affected parties before finalizing the delegated legislation.
That seems like it would be especially important in areas like environmental law, where
Right.
the stakes are so high.
Exactly. Giving people a voice before the rules are set in stone can lead to, better, more balanced outcomes.
Right.
Then there's the process of what we call laying before the legislature, which can actually take a few different forms.
Okay, let's break that down. What are these different forms of laying, and how does that impact this process?
Well, sometimes it's just for informational purposes.
Okay.
Parliament gets a heads up about the new rules, but there's no formal opportunity for them to actually intervene.
So it's just like an FYI kind of thing?
Exactly. But in other cases, there's a specific window for objections. MPs can scrutinize the rules and potentially even block them if they see problems. And in some instances, Parliament even has the power to directly amend the delegated legislation.
So different levels of control depending on the act and the potential impact?
Precisely. It really highlights why it's so important to understand the nuances of each act and how it delegates power. But even with all of these checks from Parliament and those procedural safeguards, there's one more crucial layer of control that we need to discuss:
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What's this final piece of the puzzle?
the judiciary.
Ah,
They play a vital role through what we call the Doctrine of Ultra Vires,
uh-huh.
which is essentially the ultimate weapon against executive overreach.
Ooh, that sounds powerful.
It is.
I've heard of Ultra Vires, but I'll be honest, it's a bit of a legal mystery to me.
It's a good one.
Can you break it down for us?
Yeah, think of it this way. It's like a legal shield that the courts can use to strike down any rule that's created by the executive branch if it goes beyond the authority that was given to them by that parent act.
So it's a legal power move to keep the executive branch in line.
You could say that a landmark case that really solidified this principle is the Re-Deli Laws Act of 1951.
Okay.
This case established that delegated legislation can't stray from the boundaries set by the parent act. It's a very powerful precedent.
That's fascinating. But how do the courts actually determine if something is ultra vires? What are they looking for?
Well, there are two main grounds for what we call judicial review: substantive ultra vires and procedural ultra vires. Think of it like baking a cake.
Okay.
Substantive ultra vires is if you use the wrong ingredients altogether.
Okay.
Procedural ultra vires is if you bake it at the wrong temperature, even if you have the right ingredients.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So substance is about the content of the rule itself, and procedural is about whether the process of making the rule was actually followed correctly.
Exactly. It's about making sure that both the substance of the rule and the way it was created align with the law. But the court's power actually goes even further than that. They can also challenge delegated legislation if it's deemed unreasonable, arbitrary, or discriminatory.
So even if a rule technically follows the parent act, it can still be struck down if it's just plain unfair or goes against basic rights.
Exactly. This is where Articles 14 and 19 of the Indian Constitution come into play, which guarantee equality and fundamental freedoms. A classic example is the Air India versus Nargesh Mirza case from 1981,
Oh, yeah.
where the court actually struck down a regulation that discriminated against pregnant air hostesses.
I remember that case. It really shows how the judiciary can step in to protect individual rights when delegated legislation goes too far.
Absolutely. Another important case is Dwarka Prasad versus State of UP from 1954, which established that the courts can strike down a rule if it gives excessive and arbitrary power to the executive branch, even if it's not explicitly discriminatory.
So they're looking out for any signs of power imbalance, even the fine print of these delegated legislations.
Yes.
Wow. This doctrine of Ultra Vires really is a powerful tool for judicial control. But this all sounds pretty complex. Are there any nuances or limitations to this doctrine that we need to be aware of?
Oh, there are definitely some deeper layers to explore here.
Okay.
For example, what happens if the Parent Act itself is considered untouchable because it's in the ninth schedule of the Constitution?
Ooh.
And how does the reasonableness test factor into all of this?
Okay. You've definitely piqued my curiosity. I'm ready to delve a little deeper into these complexities.
Well, then buckle up because we're about to go even further down the rabbit hole of delegated legislation.
I love it.
Yeah. Welcome back to LexTalks. Before the break, we were unpacking the doctrine of Ultra Vires. You know how it acts as a safeguard against executive overreach when it comes to this delegated legislation?
It's like having this legal safety net to make sure that these rules don't go completely off the rails.
Exactly.
But you hinted that there are some complexities with this.
Yes.
What are some of the trickier aspects of applying this ultra vires doctrine?
Well, one of the things that's really important for the courts to use this doctrine effectively is that the Parent Act needs to be very clear about what the executive can and cannot do.
Right.
It's like, setting those clear boundaries right from the start.
So if the Parent Act is vague, then it creates this gray area, and it makes it harder for the courts to step in.
Precisely. Vague language can give the executive a lot of leeway, and it could potentially tip that balance of power. And then you have the fascinating challenge of what we call malifieds,
Malified.
which is Latin for bad faith.
Okay, bad faith.
Uh-huh.
That sounds a little ominous.
Yes.
Does that mean that someone is acting with, like, malicious intent?
You got it.
Yeah.
Now, you can't strike down an entire act just because of bad faith.
Okay.
But specific rules that are created under delegated legislation can be challenged if you can prove that the rulemaker was being deliberately sneaky or harmful.
So it's not just about whether the rule is bad. It's about proving that there was an intention to deceive or to do wrong.
Exactly.
Are there any real-world examples of that?
Definitely one case that comes to mind is the B.D. Gupta versus State of Uttar Pradesh case back in 1991.
Okay.
The court made it very clear that if they found that the government had ulterior motives when they created service rules, that they could toss those rules out.
So the courts are basically saying, we're watching you, and we won't tolerate any funny business when it comes to wielding this delegated power.
That's right.
Okay. Good to know those safeguards are in place.
Definitely adds a layer of accountability. Now, another interesting twist in this whole saga is the use of what we call exclusion clauses.
Exclusion clauses, they sound kind of like loopholes.
Mm-hmm.
Is this the legislature's way of trying to shield delegated legislation from the watchful eyes of the courts?
You're catching on quickly. Sometimes the Parent Act tries to pull a fast one by including clauses that attempt to block judicial review altogether.
Oh, wow.
They might say something like, rules made under this act have effect as if enacted in the act itself.
So they're trying to make those rules untouchable by the courts.
That's right.
But thankfully, courts in India are generally not fooled by these exclusion clauses.
Okay, good.
They uphold the principle of judicial review even when the legislature tries to play hide and seek.
That's a relief. It means that no one is above the law, not even when it comes to these seemingly small delegated rules.
Exactly.
But this whole discussion kind of makes me think about something else. What happens when the Parent Act itself is considered untouchable, like when it's part of the ninth schedule of the Constitution?
That's a great question, and this gets into some really complex legal issues. Acts that are listed in the ninth schedule are given special protection. They can't be challenged just because someone says, hey, this violates my fundamental rights.
So they're shielded from certain types of judicial review.
That's the idea. But here's where it gets interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Even if the act itself is shielded, any delegated legislation that's created under that act can still be challenged if it violates other parts of the Constitution.
Ah, so it's like a partial shield.
Exactly.
The act itself might be untouchable, but the rules that are made under it can still be scrutinized? That's right.
It's all about striking that balance between protecting legislative intent and upholding constitutional rights.
Exactly. A fascinating dance between different branches of government and that delicate balance of power in a democracy.
For sure. And speaking of balance, there's one more crucial element that we need to consider, and that's the reasonableness test.
Yes.
Okay, the reasonableness test. It sounds pretty straightforward, What does that entail?
Well, in India, it's not enough for delegated legislation to simply stay within the boundaries of the Parent Act. The courts also insist that it has to be reasonable. Not just reasonable in a general sense, but reasonable in light of the fundamental rights that are enshrined in our Constitution.
So even if a rule technically follows all the procedural steps and it aligns with the Parent Act, the courts can still strike it down if they say, well, this just isn't reasonable or it disproportionately impacts people's rights.
Precisely. The Indian judiciary has consistently held that delegated legislation can't be used as a backdoor way to kind of chip away at those fundamental rights,
Yeah.
even indirectly.
So this reasonableness test really empowers the courts to be the guardians of our rights, making sure that even these seemingly small rules don't overstep their boundaries.
You've got it. It ensures that delegated legislation isn't used as a tool to basically bypass the protections that are afforded by the Constitution.
This has been such an insightful look into the world of delegated legislation and all the mechanisms that are in place to kind of keep it in check. We've got parliamentary oversight, we've got procedural safeguards, we've got the watchful eye of the judiciary.
Mm.
But I can't help but think about the individual citizen, right, who's ultimately affected by all of these rules and regulations. Where do you see the potential for conflict between the need for government efficiency and the protection of individual liberties when it comes to this whole world of delegated legislation?
That is a very important question, and one that I think we should definitely explore further.
Okay.
Because ultimately, delegated legislation does have a real impact on people's lives. It's about finding that sweet spot where the government can function effectively without trampling on those very important individual rights.
All right. Well, I'm eager to hear more about those potential conflicts
Mm.
and how we can ensure that delegated legislation is always used responsibly and ethically.
Well, then let's shift our focus to the individual citizen and explore some of those broader implications in the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to LexTalks. We've been on quite the journey exploring this whole world of delegated legislation in India and all the ways that it's kept in check.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground,
Yeah.
from the role of Parliament
Mm-hmm.
to that watchful eye of the judiciary, making sure that this delegated power doesn't run amok.
But as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I want to shift our focus to you, the individual citizen, because at the end of the day,
Yeah.
these laws, even when they're created through this delegation process, they have a very real impact on your life.
Absolutely. And this is where I think things get really interesting, especially when we consider how we balance that need for a government that can function efficiently
Right.
with the protection of those individual liberties.
It's a bit of a tightrope walk,
Yeah.
right? We want the government to be able to address pressing issues and adapt to these new situations,
Right.
but not at the expense of our fundamental rights.
Exactly. So let's talk about, some of those potential points of friction.
Mhm.
Where do you see the greatest risks to individual liberties when it comes to this idea of delegated legislation?
Well, one concern that comes to mind is just the potential for overbroad delegation.
Yes.
If Parliament gives the executive branch too much leeway, it could lead to these vague or sweeping rules that are really hard to challenge,
Right.
even if they infringe on your rights.
That's a valid concern. It's like giving the executive branch this blank check,
Yeah,
which could lead to a situation where your rights are very vulnerable
right.
to rules that are unclear or maybe overly broad.
So transparency is crucial here.
Oh, absolutely.
As citizens, we need to know what rules are being created, how they're going to be enforced, what options we have if we believe that our rights have been violated.
Access to clear, easy to understand information about these rules is essential. How can you follow the rules if you don't even know what they are?
Exactly. Another potential risk I see is the erosion of legislative accountability.
Okay.
Now, I know we talked about how delegated legislation can actually enhance accountability
Yes.
because it allows Parliament to focus on those broader policy issues.
It can.
But I feel like there's a flip side to this.
There is.
If Parliament delegates too much power without sufficient oversight,
Yeah.
it creates this disconnect between the lawmakers and how the laws are actually being implemented on the ground.
Right. So MPs might be less inclined to scrutinize those rules that are created by the executive branch if they feel like they've basically washed their hands of the responsibility.
Right. And it could lead to a situation where you, as a citizen, feel like you have fewer avenues for recourse if you have a problem with those rules.
Absolutely. It's like being stuck in a bureaucratic maze with no way out.
Yeah. And if you feel like Parliament is less involved, then you might feel like your voice isn't being heard.
Exactly. And that's why those strong procedural safeguards are so important. Things like mandatory consultation with affected parties, public hearings, opportunities for you to provide feedback.
Right.
Those can all help ensure that your perspective is considered.
It's about making sure you have a meaningful role in this process, that your voice is heard
Right.
before those rules become set in stone.
Right. And it's also about making sure that there's that robust system of checks and balances within the government itself.
Right.
Those parliamentary committees we discussed,
Yeah.
they are essential
Uh-huh.
in scrutinizing that delegated legislation and making sure it aligns with the Act's intent and that it doesn't infringe upon those fundamental rights.
So it sounds like what we need is this multi-pronged approach.
Yes.
Clear boundaries set by Parliament in the Parent Act.
Yes.
Strong procedural safeguards, active oversight from MPs and those committees, and a judiciary that's ready to step in if necessary.
You hit the nail on the head. But even with all of those safeguards in place,
Right.
we have to remember the human factor.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
Well, even with the best intentions, right? Those in power might be tempted to use delegated legislation for purposes that weren't originally intended, or they might just overlook that potential impact on individual liberties.
It's a good reminder that power, even when it's delegated,
Yeah.
can be a slippery slope.
Hmm.
And that's why an informed and engaged citizenry is absolutely crucial.
I couldn't agree more. As citizens, you need to understand your rights, be aware of the rules that are being made, and be ready to hold those in power accountable.
It's like the old saying, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.
Yes.
Democracy is not a spectator sport.
Right.
We can't just sit back and assume that things will work out on their own.
Exactly. And that's why we do what we do here at LexTalks.
Yes.
By demystifying these legal concepts and empowering citizens with knowledge, we hope to create a more informed and engaged public discourse.
Well, this deep dive into the world of delegated legislation has been incredibly enlightening. We've seen how it can be this valuable tool for effective governance, but also how it needs to be very carefully controlled to protect those individual rights.
It's about finding that delicate balance between efficiency and liberty and ensuring that the power to make laws, even when it's delegated,
Right.
is always used responsibly and with respect for those fundamental rights as citizens.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into delegated legislation. We hope you found this exploration informative and engaging.
Remember, knowledge is power. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep those legal gears turning.
Thanks for being here. Don't forget to subscribe to LexTalks for more deep dives into the fascinating world of Indian law. Until next time.